Man, I love coffee. I love everything about coffee. I drink it every day and I always look forward to my morning cup of coffee. I can talk about coffee all day, every day. And honestly, I can make a whole series about it. From its origins, to the different types of coffee beans, to the process of roasting and different brewing methods, what the anatomy of a coffee bean is, what chemicals are in coffee and how it affects us. But today I will only talk about how caffeine affects people. Did you know that caffeine is one of the most commonly used psychoactive substances in the world? About 90% of adults consume caffeine, usually in the form of things like coffee and tea. So if you're like most people, your day probably starts with a cup of coffee or some caffeinated drink. According to the FDA, the daily recommended intake for caffeine is around 400 milligrams max for healthy adults. A typical cup of brewed coffee has about 150 milligrams of caffeine in a 12-ounce cup. Energy drinks like Red Bull has about 80 milligrams of caffeine in an 8.4 ounce can. So how does caffeine work? Does it give us energy? What time is the best to drink it? How long does it stay in our bodies? So in today's video, I am going to answer these questions and talk about how caffeine affects the body and brain, some of its pros and cons, whether there are safe or unsafe amounts. But before we go into discussing caffeine, we must first understand why we feel tired in the first place. Throughout the day, our brains produce a molecule called adenosine, which is a neuromodulator that builds up while you're awake and increases sleep pressure. The longer we stay awake, the longer the buildup in our brains and body. Adenosine exists throughout the body and has receptors in many tissues, but we'll focus on how it affects the brain. So throughout the day, your brain cells are working and using up energy called ATP. As they burn the energy, the byproducts is adenosine, and the buildup is what tells our brains, hey, I'm tired and sleepy. As adenosine builds up in the brain, it attaches to receptors on neurons, which is what signals our bodies that we are tired. Okay, so keep that in mind. So caffeine is a bitter tasting, naturally occurring stimulant found naturally in plants. It's part of a group of compounds called methylxanthines. Caffeine can come from two different sources, naturally or synthetically made. We can find caffeine in nature like coffee beans, tea leaves, and guarana, but caffeine used in many sodas and energy drinks, unless specified, is often synthetically produced. Chemists first synthesized caffeine in the late 1800s, and today it is commonly manufactured through a series of chemical reactions using simple chemical precursors, sometimes involving compounds related to urea chemistry. Fun fact, urea is a compound that is found in urine, but don't worry. The caffeine used in food and beverages is highly purified and produced at food grade quality. So whether caffeine comes from coffee beans or a laboratory, the molecule is exactly the same. Your body can't tell the difference. Okay, so caffeine looks very similar to adenosine. Normally, adenosine binds to receptors in your brain, and when it does, it signals to your body that it's time to feel tired. But when you consume caffeine, it competes for those same receptors. Caffeine essentially sneaks in and attaches itself to the adenosine receptors. Even though caffeine has a structure similar enough to adenosine to bind to those receptors, it's not exactly the same chemical structure, so it doesn't activate them. So instead of triggering the signal that makes you feel tired, it blocks adenosine from binding and prevents that tired signal from being sent. Think of adenosine as a key and the receptor as a lock. Caffeine fits into the lock, but doesn't activate it or open the door. This is why scientists describe caffeine as an adenosine receptor antagonist, meaning it blocks the receptor instead of activating it. It basically prevents adenosine from doing its job. It's not that your brain is energized, you just can't detect how tired you really are. But how do scientists actually know that caffeine blocks adenosine receptors? In the 1970s, researchers began studying how caffeine interacts with brain cells. Using radio-labeled molecules, scientists could track what chemicals were binding to receptors in the brain. What they discovered was that caffeine was attaching to the same receptors that adenosine normally binds to. Okay, so we now know that caffeine blocks adenosine receptors. Adenosine does more than just make you feel tired and sleepy. It usually suppresses excitatory neurotransmitters and the system that releases it. When caffeine blocks adenosine, it's like the brain brain's brake pedal comes off. Neural activity and arousal systems become more active, which can lead to increased alertness, improved focus and reaction time, and sometimes improved mood, which is why caffeine makes you feel mentally sharp. But depending on the dose and sensitivity, caffeine can also increase the sympathetic activity. That's where the restlessness, jitterness, or anxious edge can come from. Like I mentioned before, adenosine and its receptors are found throughout the body. The caffeine affects your entire body. You may notice increased heart rate, heightened awareness, reduced perception of effort, and increased physical performance. This is why caffeine is one of the most widely used performance-enhancing substance in the world. And caffeine can also act as a mild diuretic for some people, meaning you might pee more, especially if you're not used to it. But remember that the brain is very adaptable. If you regularly consume caffeine, your brain responds by creating more adenosine receptors to try and restore balance, which means that over time, the same amount of caffeine doesn't have the same effect, and you need more to feel alert. That's how you build tolerance. And if you suddenly stop caffeine after daily use, those extra receptors can make adenosine hit harder, which is why withdrawal happens. If you quit caffeine suddenly, common withdrawal symptoms include headaches, fatigue, brain fog, irritability. These symptoms occur because the brain still has an increased number of adenosine receptors. Gradually reducing caffeine intake can help minimize these withdrawal symptoms. Is caffeine addictive? In clinical settings, caffeine is not considered strongly addictive. It does not typically cause the harmful behaviors associated with substances like nicotine, amphetamines, or other drugs. However, it can lead to dependence, meaning people may experience withdrawal symptoms when they stop using it. So yeah, caffeine blocks adenosine receptors, but just because it's being blocked doesn't mean that it's still not building up. It doesn't stop accumulating. So when caffeine finally wears off, all of the accumulated adenosine binds to the receptors again, and that's the caffeine crash. You feel tired, sometimes even more tired than before. Caffeine's half-life is around 5 hours, but it varies from person to person. So if you drink coffee at 3 p.m., a meaningful amount of caffeine may still be active during bedtime. And even if you fall asleep, caffeine can reduce sleep quality, especially deep sleep, which can set up a cycle of needing more caffeine the next day. So in moderation, caffeine can improve attention and concentration, enhance physical performance, elevate mood, increase mental endurance. But higher doses can increase anxiety and jitters, heart rate and sleep deprivation, and dependence or withdrawal symptoms. A lot of the difference comes from dosage, timing, and your biology. But for many people, it's a useful cognitive tool. Not everyone experiences caffeine the same way. Some people metabolize caffeine quickly, others slowly, often due to genetic differences in liver enzymes. That's why one person can drink espresso at night and sleep fine, while another feels anxious after half a cup. So to summarize, caffeine works primarily by blocking adenosine receptors in the brain, preventing the buildup of fatigue signals and increasing alertness, and works best when strategically used. Many sleep researchers recommend waiting about 60 to 90 minutes after waking before consuming caffeine, allowing your natural alertness system to activate first, and also not drinking it too late in the day. So yeah, that's how caffeine affects the body and brain. I love learning about everyday things we don't usually think about, like what your morning coffee is actually doing inside you. Understanding how caffeine works allows people to make informed decisions about how they want to use it in their everyday life. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and comment down below if there are other topics you would like me to talk about, or if you would want a deeper dive of this topic. Bye! Coffee.